The sky wasn't supposed to look like that. One moment, it was an ordinary day, commuters rushing to work, kids laughing in schoolyards, the hum of life carrying on as it always had. The next, the sun vanished, not behind clouds, not in an eclipse, but under the sheer, impossible bulk of ships so vast they blotted out the light. Cities froze as shadows stretched like ink across the streets, swallowing skyscrapers whole. Then came the voice. It wasn't broadcast through speakers or radios. It was inside everyone's heads, a thunderous command that vibrated in the bones. Surrender or be annihilated. No demands, no negotiations, just a choice between chains or death. And within hours, humanity learned what it meant to lose. But here's the thing about us, the truth those invaders missed as they herded us into labor camps, as they stripped our leaders of power and dismantled our armies. They saw a fractured species divided by borders and ideologies, easy to break. What they didn't see was the fire beneath the surface, the quiet defiance in a mother's grip on a child's hand, the clenched fists of scientists staring at alien tech not with fear but hunger. Because humanity's greatest weapon was never our weapons at all, it was our mind, our refusal to accept chains even when they seemed unbreakable. And so, when the invaders proudly declared Earth theirs after a single day of conquest, they made their first fatal mistake. They assumed the war was over. They didn't realize they'd just lit the fuse. What followed wasn't a rebellion, it was something far darker, far more creative. A storm of human ingenuity and rage, where every suppressed engineer, every cornered soldier, every ordinary person forced to kneel became a spark in the coming inferno. Because here's the truth no conqueror ever remembers until it's too late. You can enslave a planet, but you can't enslave an idea, and humanity, we're full of bad ideas. Especially for anyone foolish enough to think they own us. This is the story of how Earth lost, and how, in losing, we set the stage for the most brutal lesson the galaxy would ever learn. A lesson written not in treaties or battles, but in the cold, calculated revenge of a species that never forgets. Strap in, the fall was just the beginning. The ruins of New York still smoked when the first whispers of rebellion began. Beneath the skeletal remains of skyscrapers, in subway tunnels where the invaders' surveillance drones rarely ventured, a grizzled Marine sergeant named Elena Voss gathered the broken and the furious. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't even an officer anymore, just a man with a rusting combat knife and a promise carved into his voice like a blade. They think we're weak, he told the hollow-eyed survivors, their faces lit by flickering emergency lights. But we'll show them hell. It wasn't a speech, it wasn't grand, it was a spark thrown into dry tinder. Their first move wasn't an attack, it was theft. An alien supply depot, stacked with gleaming canisters of something that hummed like living metal, sat lightly guarded on the outskirts of Queens. The invaders hadn't bothered with heavy security, why would they? They'd broken entire armies in hours. What threat could starving civilians pose? Vance's crew didn't storm the gates. They didn't fire a shot. Instead, a 12-year-old girl who'd lost her family in the initial bombardment walked up to the perimeter fence, sobbing, playing the perfect victim. When the lone guard leaned down to grab her, she drove a shiv of rebar into his throat. The others moved in silence, siphoning fuel, smashing control panels, leaving behind a single message spray painted in the guard's blood: "Welcome to Earth." News of the strike spread like wildfire in a world without wires. Radio operators hiding in basements whispered it. Street kids scrawled the symbol of Vance's cell, a broken chain inside a circle, on walls from Mumbai to Moscow. For the first time since the sky went dark, humanity remembered what it felt like to strike back. The invaders retaliated, of course. They leveled whole blocks, dragged suspected rebels into the streets. But every act of brutality only fed the fire, because Vance's real weapon wasn't sabotage. It wasn't even violence. It was the one thing the conquerors couldn't suppress: the relentless, contagious certainty that resistance wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And so, in the shadow of their own defeat, humanity began rewriting the rules of war, not with generals or treaties, but with stolen tools, whispered codes, and the unshakable knowledge that every oppressor makes one fatal mistake. They assume the broken stay broken, but under the boot heel of tyranny, even shattered bones can sharpen into weapons. Dr. Elena Voss had once studied pulsars, collapsed stars spinning so fast they warped spacetime itself. Now, as she scraped nutrient paste from a metal bowl in an alien holding cell, she found it bitterly ironic that she might die studying something far simpler, the rhythm of the guards' patrols. 3 steps past her door, a hesitation, then the hum of their biometric scanners. Every 6 hours, like clockwork, the invaders were meticulous, precise. Predictable, that predictability was their first mistake. The second was putting her in a labor camp near what remained of the Arecibo Observatory. When the aliens forced her to catalog their stolen Earth tech, she'd seen it the way their ship's drives pulsed in sync with our planet's magnetic poles, like moths drawn to a flame. At first, she thought it was shielding. Then she noticed the panic in their voices when solar flares disrupted the field. Not inconvenience, not discomfort. Terror. They're not just using the magnetic field, she whispered to the gaunt-faced engineer chained beside her, a man whose name she'd never learned. They're dependent on it. Their neural networks are hardwired to it like a compass needle. If we disrupt it, they'll be blind, he finished, eyes widening. Not with hope, with something darker, something human. The plan wasn't elegant, it couldn't be. They had no weapons, no comms, just the broken pieces of the world left unguarded because the conquerors didn't understand their value. A decommissioned nuclear reactor's core buried under rubble, a child's EMP toy confiscated but not destroyed, and Elena's own research smuggled in the only place they hadn't thought to look, tattooed in conductive ink across her ribs, invisible until activated by the right frequency. When the guards came for the next work shift, they didn't notice the engineer's shaking hands weren't from fear, or that Elena's tattered coat now hummed faintly, its lining woven with stripped power cables. Because the greatest weakness of any empire is assuming the conquered don't pay attention, that they don't learn. By midnight, the first pulse surged through the camp's stolen grid. Not enough to trigger alarms, just a flicker, a hiccup in the magnetic field. But Elena saw the way the guards staggered, their pupils dilating like men drowning in sudden vertigo. She smiled then, sharp as the scalpel hidden in her sleeve. The aliens had taken their planet, their freedom, their sky, but they'd left Elena Voss her mind. And that, as the pulsing glow of emergency lights painted the walls like a dying star, was about to become their final mistake. The aliens never saw the kid coming. In a cramped Tokyo apartment, lit only by the glow of emergency power cells, 16-year-old Ren Amory cracked his knuckles over a keyboard cobbled together from scavenged parts. The invaders had severed the internet within hours of landing, but they'd missed the old infrastructure, the fiber optic veins buried deep under the city, the microwave relays disguised as cell towers. Ren had spent the occupation mapping them like a thief studying a vault. It started as a game, a way to prove he could outthink the conquerors who'd turned his world into a prison. He'd intercepted their low-level comms first maintenance logs, supply manifests, the dull hum of an empire too confident to encrypt its whispers, but then he found the battle feeds. Real-time troop movements, attack schedules, even the biometric readouts of their commanders. The data pulsed on his screen like a heartbeat, and Ren realized something terrifying. The aliens weren't gods. They were just soldiers, fallible, predictable, hackable. The code he wrote wasn't elegant, just a brute force cascade of exploits, stitched together with the desperation of someone with nothing left to lose. When he triggered it, the effect was instantaneous. Every screen still powered in Tokyo flickered to life, flooding streets and shattered storefronts with raw tactical data. Security footage of alien officers arguing over flanking maneuvers, deployment orders for a mass execution in Sao Paulo. Worst of all, the commander's own voice snarling in their guttural tongue. Burn the resistance nests. No survivors. Ren didn't stop there. He piggybacked the signal onto emergency broadcast bands, bouncing it off dead satellites until the message blared from car radios in Berlin, from flickering billboards in Dubai. For the first time in months, humanity saw the enemy's hand before they played it. The alien response was immediate. Their warships swarmed Tokyo's skies, scanners probing for the source of the leak. Ren's last transmission was a single line of text, flashing across screens worldwide as his apartment building erupted in plasma fire. They're scared. Make them scream. Chaos followed. Rebels ambushed patrols at their staging points. Crowds rioted where the aliens planned to strike. The commander's rage boiled over in a global broadcast, their voice shaking with something no one had heard before, not anger. Fear, find that human, they roared, but it was too late. Ren had already become something far more dangerous than a target. He'd become proof, because the moment the invaders admitted one kid could unravel their plans, they'd lost the only war that ever mattered, the war of ideas. And in the neon-lit ruins of Tokyo, as the first homemade EMP devices flared to life in imitation of Ren's hack, the galaxy learned a brutal truth. Humanity didn't need starships or superweapons to fight back. Just a keyboard, a brain, and the unshakable belief that no cage, no matter how advanced, could hold them for long. The Amazon jungle had always been a place of hidden dangers, venomous snakes, choking vines, predators that moved unseen through the canopy. But now, something far deadlier moved through the undergrowth. Lieutenant Carter Silver adjusted the rusted wiring of his makeshift EMP device, sweat dripping down his neck. The aliens had learned to avoid cities, to crush organized resistance, so the fight had gone underground, into the places their scanners couldn't penetrate, where the humid air itself seemed to swallow their technology whole. The ambush was set along an old logging trail, now repurposed as an alien supply route. Silver's team hadn't just placed EMP mines, they'd rigged the trees themselves. Carbonized vines, soaked in conductive gel, hung like nooses waiting to snap. When the first patrol hummed into view on their anti-grav sleds, they didn't even look down. Why would they? The rebels had no heavy weapons, no air support, just desperation and the kind of creativity that only comes when you've got nothing left to lose. Silver's signal came not through comms, those were too easily intercepted, but through the sharp cry of a howler monkey, mimicked perfectly by one of his fighters. The jungle erupted. The EMPs flared in sequence, frying the sled's propulsion systems mid-air. Vines lashed out as the sleds crashed, entangling the aliens in a net of live wires. The patrol's commander barely had time to scream into his radio before a machete, forged from melted-down car parts, silenced him forever. But not before his last words crackled across the alien command network. They're adapting too fast, we're losing control. That phrase became a rallying cry, not just in the jungle but everywhere, because the aliens had made a fatal assumption that war had rules, that suppression worked the same on every species. They didn't understand how quickly humans could turn a farmer's fertilizer into explosives, how street gangs and university professors would share blueprints for pulse rifles in abandoned subway tunnels. They especially didn't grasp the terrifying truth that when you push a species to the brink, innovation doesn't slow down, it accelerates. By the time the alien high command received that final transmission, similar ambushes were already unfolding in the Siberian tundra, the sewers of Paris, the coral reefs of the Pacific. Each one a brutal reminder, humanity didn't need to win every battle, just enough of them to prove the invaders were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. And in the blood-soaked mud of the Amazon, as Silver's team vanished back into the green hell the aliens couldn't tame, one truth became undeniable: you can conquer a planet. But you can't conquer a people who have decided you're nothing more than prey. The prototype wasn't pretty, a Frankenstein's monster of scavenged alien circuits and jury-rigged human tech, soldered together in the damp basement of a ruined power station. Elena's hands shook as she calibrated the final sequence, her fingertips raw from stripping live wires without tools. Across the room, the engineer whose name she'd finally learned was Jakob, held up a cracked tablet showing real-time magnetic field fluctuations. "It'll work," he whispered, though his voice carried more hope than certainty. But the backlash could fry every unshielded neural network on the continent. Including ours, Elena barely had time to nod before the wall exploded. Alien shock troops poured through the dust and debris, their combat suits rendering them immune to small arms fire, a precaution Jakob had anticipated. He triggered the emergency pulse before they could take 3 steps, sending a localized burst through the room's improvised Faraday cage. For one glorious second, the invaders convulsed as their suits' neural interfaces overloaded. Then the backup units arrived. They took Jakob first, slamming him against the concrete so hard his collarbone snapped audibly. Elena lunged for the activation switch, but a gauntleted fist caught her across the temple, sending her sprawling. As they dragged her backward by her hair, she caught sight of the prototype still humming on the workbench, its indicator lights blinking innocently. One thought burned through the pain: distance doesn't matter if the signal's strong enough. With the last of her strength, she wrenched free just enough to scream at the ceiling, knowing the microtransmitter sewn into her collar would carry her voice to every resistant cell within 50 miles. Activate it remotely now. What happened next wasn't the calculated disruption they'd planned. Without Jakob's precision tuning, the device unleashed a raw, unfiltered surge straight into Earth's magnetosphere. The sky didn't just flicker, it convulsed, rippling with auroras where none belonged, bleeding unnatural greens and purples across the horizon like a dying monitor. Inside their armored command centers, alien officers collapsed mid-sentence, noses bleeding from sudden synaptic feedback. Out in the streets, human prisoners watched in awe as their captors staggered, clutching their heads and screaming in a language that suddenly, gloriously, sounded as vulnerable as their own. Elena's last sight before the stun baton sent her into darkness was the lead invader clawing at his helmet display, his voice cracking with something she'd never heard from his kind before: undiluted panic. They're weaponizing the planet, and in that moment, as the prototype's backfeed lit up every unshielded alien system from Buenos Aires to Beijing, humanity discovered a terrifying truth: the invaders weren't just vulnerable to Earth's magnetic field. They were allergic to it, which meant the greatest weapon in human history wasn't something they'd built. It was the ground beneath their feet all along. The alien dreadnoughts shuddered like wind-tossed leaves, their sleek hulls suddenly betraying them. Gravity drives sputtered, navigation screens dissolved into static, and for the first time since their conquest began, the masters of the stars found themselves at the mercy of a force they couldn't control: Earth itself. Down in the ruins of Geneva, a 14-year-old hacker named Liesel watched her stolen feed flicker with savage glee as the invaders' comms erupted in panicked bursts. Primary systems offline, neural sync failure. Commander, the planet is attacking us. High above, the alien fleet's formation unraveled in real time. What had been a flawless sphere of warships now listed drunkenly, their precision crumbling as the magnetic pulse Elena's device had triggered reverberated through the atmosphere. The lead command vessel's shields faltered for 3 critical seconds, just long enough for a salvaged human missile, launched from the ashes of Cape Canaveral by a team of ex-NASA engineers, to punch through its armored belly. The explosion bloomed silently in the vacuum, but its shockwave rippled across every screen still broadcasting on Earth. On the ground, people who'd spent months with their faces in the dirt dared to look up. In Manila, a grandmother gripping her grandchildren's hands gasped as an alien dropship spiraled into the bay, its engines coughing blue flame. outside Moscow, partisans who'd been pinned down in a subway tunnel erupted into ragged cheers as their hunters' hovering fortresses sank into the mud like stricken whales. And in what was left of London, a LONE Chinese letter IST played a halting rendition of "The World Turned Upside Down Amid the Rubble," the notes carrying farther than any broadcast. The High Commander's final order, retreat to orbit, came too late for half their fleet. Human crews, many operating equipment they'd barely had time to understand, unleashed everything from retrofitted cruise missiles to jury-rigged railguns. The sky burned with improvised vengeance, but the true turning point wasn't the destruction. It was the silence that followed when the last alien ship limped out of range. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of a predator realizing too late that its prey had fangs, because humanity hadn't just fought back. We'd weaponized our own home, turned the planet's heartbeat into a blade. And as the first unshackled satellites rebooted overhead, blinking to life like awakened sentinels, the message scrolling across their screens wasn't one of victory. It was a promise spelled out in the broken grammar of 100 rebel coders. Try coming back, see what happens. Somewhere beyond the moon, the aliens were regrouping. But below, in the radioactive dawn of a world they'd thought broken, every still-standing radio tower began transmitting a single looping sound, the crackling hiss of an open microphone. Waiting, the war wasn't over, it had just changed theaters, and this time Earth held the high ground. The first human ship to break orbit wasn't a warship. It was a retrofitted cargo hauler, its hull still streaked with the logos of a long-dead shipping company, its thrusters jury-rigged with parts stripped from downed alien fighters. But when it slammed into the flank of a disabled invasion cruiser, shearing through its unshielded engines like a knife through foil, the radio chatter across every rebel frequency erupted into something between laughter and battle cries. They called themselves the Scrap Fleet, a dozen vessels at most, patched together from fishing trawlers, private yachts, even a stolen orbital construction barge. None were built for war, but necessity had sharpened them into something far more dangerous. Their weapons were whatever they'd looted or reverse-engineered. Plasma cutters rewired into cannons, mining lasers amplified with alien focusing crystals, one particularly deranged engineer's attempt to turn a satellite dish into an EMP emitter. And at the helm of these floating death traps, pilots who'd never trained for zero-G combat, but who knew the solar system like the backs of their hands. "Watch that debris field at 2 o'clock, crackled the voice of Captain Mera Soto over the fleet's makeshift comms, her old Martian survey ship dodging a hail of retaliatory fire. Their targeting systems can't handle high-density clutter, use the asteroids as cover. The invaders had expected resistance planetside, but this, human ships dancing through the wreckage of their own fleet, exploiting every blind spot in alien sensor ranges, turning the cold emptiness of space into a lethal playground. That hadn't been in their invasion briefings. Then came the moment that would echo through every history textbook for centuries. A rookie pilot named Javier Ruiz, steering a repurposed fuel tender with all the grace of a drunken cow, somehow managed to loop his ungainly vessel behind a crippled alien destroyer. His weapon, a single stolen torpedo, duct taped to his ship's hull and rigged to fire by yanking on a cable. When it detonated square in the destroyer's reactor core, the shockwave sent Javier's ship spinning wildly, but not before his whooping voice burst over every open channel. "Welcome to our backyard, Hijos Deputa." The Scrap Fleet's victory wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. For months, humanity had fought on the defensive, scrambling to survive on a planet they no longer controlled. But as those rickety ships tore through orbit, picking off disabled warships like vultures circling a dying beast, something shifted. The aliens had come thinking space was theirs. Now, watching a stolen luxury cruiser, its swimming pool still half full, ram straight through a fighter squadron, they faced an awful truth. Humans didn't just survive in the void. We thrived in it. By the time the last alien carriers fled toward the asteroid belt, their retreat broadcast on open frequencies for all Earth to hear, the scrap fleet had lost half its ships. But the survivors floated in the sudden quiet of reclaimed orbit, their hulls scorched and leaking air, their crews exhausted beyond words, and on every surviving vessel, from the bridge of Mera's survey ship to Javier's battered fuel hauler, the same realization settled like stardust. They hadn't just won a battle, they'd proven that even the stars weren't safe from human stubbornness, and somewhere beyond Pluto's icy reach, the invaders were about to learn the hard way: space is big. But nowhere near big enough to hide from us. The transmission crackled across light years, warped by solar winds and desperation, a distress signal so degraded it took the alien High Synod 3 full rotations to decipher. What they extracted from the noise sent shockwaves through their crystalline halls. Evacuation orders, reports of ships falling like meteors, and beneath it all, a terrified refrain: the planet fights back. Before their scholars could fully dissect the implications, their holographic displays flickered violently, overtaken by a foreign signal. No encryption, no preamble. Just 12 words in jagged alien script, a language they'd forced humanity to learn during occupation, now thrown back at them like a blade. You came uninvited. Leave or burn with the rest. For a species that had conquered 17 worlds without defeat, the message was more than an insult, it was an impossibility. Their tech was superior, their strategies flawless, yet somehow these hairless primates had not only resisted annihilation, but counterattacked using tools ripped from their own grasp. The Synod's debates raged for cycles. Was this a bluff, a final act of defiance from a broken foe? Then the second transmission hit, this one piggybacking on their own quantum relays, a feat that should have required millennia of advancement. It wasn't words this time, it was footage. Security feeds from their own ships played back in horrifying clarity. Human boarding parties wielding their plasma cutters to carve through bulkheads, children reprogramming battle drones with crude code, and entire mining colonies worth of explosives strapped to a stolen freighter and aimed at their flagship's bridge. Worst of all were the faces of their own soldiers, not just defeated but terrified, their quadruple pupils blown wide as humans advanced with the cold patience of executioners. The final image froze on every screen in the Synod chamber, a human child no older than 8 terrestrial years placing a crudely drawn skull and crossbones sticker onto the side of a captured dreadnought. The accompanying audio wasn't translated. It didn't need to be. Laughter transcended language. Deep in their birthing caverns, the Synod's eldest, a being older than human civilization, let out a sound none of its brood had ever heard. Not grief, not rage, something far worse, dawning recognition. We thought we were harvesting a world. It rasped, its carapace vibrating with the weight of revelation. Instead, we poked a hive. On Earth, radio operators tracking the signals grinned as the alien comm channels erupted into chaos. No more orders, no more threats. Just the unmistakable sound of an empire realizing far too late that some wars couldn't be won, only survived, and humanity, we'd already moved on to the next lesson. Hunting season had just begun. The alien fleet didn't shatter all at once, it came apart in stages like a dying star shedding its layers. First, the deserters. Whole battalions of their shock troops, their neural links to command severed by Earth's magnetic pulse, simply stopped. Some tore off their helmets and let the atmosphere burn their lungs, preferring suffocation to whatever punishment awaited them for failure. Others knelt in the dirt outside human strongholds, their weapons discarded, hands raised in a gesture they'd learned from their prisoners. The sight of their conquerors begging for mercy lit a fire in the survivors' chests fiercer than any propaganda. Then came the runners, ships that had escaped orbit now fractured further, their crews turning on each other as supplies dwindled. Intercepted transmissions told the story. Mutinies over ration control, officers venting entire decks to silence dissent, navigation systems deliberately sabotaged to avoid returning home in disgrace. A few made it as far as Jupiter before their reactors failed, their last signals looping the same frantic question: what do we tell the High Synod? No one got the chance to answer, because on the 7th day after the pulse, a lone figure in patched-together armor climbed the scorched hull of the alien flagship, its once gleaming surface now cracked open like an egg, and planted Earth's flag where their command spire had been. Corporal Leon Nguyen wasn't a hero by any official measure, just a mechanic from Hanoi who'd lost her entire family in the first bombardment. But when she grinned down at the crowd of liberated prisoners gathering below, her teeth gleaming in the firelight of burning wrecks, the roar that went up shook the very wreckage under her boots. 1 month, she shouted, her voice hoarse from smoke and laughter. That's all it took to break you. The footage spread faster than the fighting ever had. Not just because it showed humanity's defiance in vivid color, but because of what flickered in the background: alien crew members, their carapaces dull with shock, being led away in restraints by farmers wielding repurposed mining tools. The galaxy's so-called masters, cowed by the very species they'd written off as weak. And as Earth's battered but unbowed militias began the long work of cataloging the abandoned tech, of interrogating prisoners who suddenly found their universal translators very cooperative, a single truth crystallized in the ashes. The war hadn't just been won, it had rewritten the rules, because now every species in the Orion Arm knew 2 things: humanity doesn't forgive, and we never forget. Somewhere in the dark between stars, the last fleeing invaders would carry that lesson home, assuming, of course, they made it back at all. The bloodstained data drive flickered in Elena's shaking hands, its alien alloy still warm from the wreckage of the command ship. Around her, the makeshift lab hummed with scavenged tech, salvaged monitors, jury-rigged translation matrices, a coffee-stained map of the solar system studded with red pins marking every confirmed alien wreck. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights decoding their archives, peeling back layers of encryption with Jakob's feverish help. Now, as the last firewall crumbled, the screen flooded with tactical schematics. And Elena Voss, who'd weaponized a planet's magnetic field, who'd stared down conquerors without blinking, felt her breath stop. These weren't frontline troops, she whispered. The words tasted like ash. The lab fell silent as the others turned fighters still in scorched armor, engineers with hands permanently stained from handling alien circuitry. Elena zoomed in on a single tactical report, its glyphs translating to gut-chilling clarity. Harvesters dispatched per Synod Directive 117, soften resistance for main fleet. A holo projector sputtered to life, casting a grainy image above the workbench. Not warships, not invasion plans, something far worse: massive, beetle-like vessels drifting in the void between galaxies, each easily 20 times the size of the ships that had enslaved Earth. Their hulls pulsed with organic growth, their weapon ports wide enough to swallow cities whole. Scouts, Elena said hoarsely, that's all we fought. A scouting party. Jakob's chair clattered as he stood too fast. Then where's the main fleet? The star map on the wall answered before Elena could. A blinking trajectory line arced from the edge of known space, terminating just beyond Pluto's orbit. Estimated arrival time, 6 months. Estimated firepower, enough to glass the planet 10 times over. For the first time since the war began, the resistance leaders didn't cheer, didn't vow defiance. They just stared at the screen, at the cold calculus of extinction staring back. Then Elena exhaled sharply and punched a new sequence into the console. The display shifted to Earth's battered but functional shipyards, to the half-built dreadnoughts rising from the bones of captured alien tech, to the scrap fleet's jury-rigged monstrosities currently patrolling Mars. Good news, she said, mouth curling into something too sharp to be a smile. They think they're coming for prey. She tapped the screen where Wren's last hack still flickered in the corner, a child's scrawled promise over alien bloodstains. We'll show them hell. Bad news. Elena let the projection zoom out, revealing the true scale of the approaching armada. They have no idea what hell actually looks like. Outside, the first unshackled orbital defense cannons powered up with a whine that shook the broken windows. Somewhere in the ruins, a radio crackled to life with the old Marine's voice, Vance, who'd started this war with a knife and a promise. His words echoed through the lab, carried on a current of static and defiance. Lock and load, kids. Round two's gonna be educational. The screen flickered one last time before dying, freezing on the alien fleet's insignia, a stylized galaxy being crushed in a clawed grip. Appropriate, Elena thought as she reached for her welding torch, because humanity had spent a month learning how to break claws. Now they'd teach the galaxy how to rip. The streets of Earth hadn't seen celebrations like this in generations, maybe ever. From the irradiated ruins of Berlin to the half-flooded husk of Miami, people poured into what was left of the open air, dancing under skies no longer choked by alien warships. In New Beijing, they burned piles of discarded enemy armor in towering bonfires, the heat warping the metal into grotesque sculptures of defeat. In Nairobi, children too young to remember a free world clung to their parents' backs as fireworks salvaged from pre-invasion stockpiles exploded in colors no one had seen since the first ships blotted out the sun. But in a dim corner of Luna's makeshift command hub, a haggard comms officer named Rafik Hassan wasn't cheering. His headset crackled with interference from the outer system, a garbled stream of data that made his stomach twist. "Run it again," he ordered his console, fingers flying over keys worn smooth from constant use. The screen flickered, resolving into a jagged waveform, a signal from Pluto's listening post, or what was left of it. The playback lasted 3 seconds, a voice, human at first, shouting coordinates, then something else, something wrong. A screech that shouldn't have been possible in vacuum, layered with a bass thrum that vibrated Rafik's teeth even at low volume. And then, just as the unknown vessel's silhouette eclipsed Pluto's pale glow on the feed, 2 words that froze his blood. "They're here," the transmission cut with a finality that left no room for hope. Rafik's hand hovered over the alert siren. He'd seen enough death to know what came next, the way triumphant laughter in the corridors outside would turn to silence, then to screams. How the makeshift hospitals would overflow within hours. How the scrap fleet's battered heroes would be recalled from their victory laps to face something far worse than harvesters. Outside the reinforced glass, Earth spun peacefully, its night side dotted with the glowing veins of reborn cities. Somewhere down there, Elena Voss was probably dismantling another piece of alien tech, Jakob at her side. Vance was likely drilling new recruits in some crater-pocked wasteland. Wren's ghost was surely still grinning in the static of every hacked alien terminal. They'd earned this moment, this breath before the storm. Rafik's finger lingered, then he punched the coordinates into the long-range scanner instead of hitting the alarm. Let them dance a little longer, let the fires burn, because the thing that had swallowed Plutocom's station whole wasn't just coming, it was hungry, and this time the monsters wouldn't underestimate humanity. Which meant, Rafik realized as the scanner pinged with a contact the size of a small moon drifting past Neptune, that the real war was only just beginning. The United Nations Assembly Hall hadn't seen this kind of unity since the first alien ships darkened the skies. Diplomats who'd once bickered over borders now stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at the holographic projection flickering above the ruined podium. A live feed from the edge of the solar system showing the dark silhouettes of the approaching armada. The air smelled of sweat and ozone from the jury-rigged power grid keeping the lights on. When General Adisa Okoye of the West African Federation slammed her fist on the cracked marble table, the sound echoed like a gunshot. "They think we'll kneel again," she growled, her augmented eye whirring as it zoomed in on the tactical readouts. "This time we turn their toys against them." Across the globe, factories that had once churned out consumer drones and electric cars now hummed with a different purpose. In the skeletal remains of Detroit, workers welded salvaged alien plasma conduits onto retrofitted missile silos. Beneath the Himalayas, engineers in radiation suits calibrated stolen gravity disruptors inside hollowed-out nuclear bunkers. Even the Vatican's ancient catacombs had become a workshop, where priests and physicists alike scribbled equations across frescoed walls, repurposing ecclesiastical relics into relay stations for the planetary defense grid. The message was clear: every scrap of alien technology, every inch of human ingenuity would be weaponized. The general's order, load every weapon we have, wasn't just a command. It was a promise. Satellite feeds showed railgun batteries rising from the Australian outback like steel flowers blooming in reverse. The remnants of the scrap fleet docked at orbital platforms, their hulls bristling with freshly installed cannons stripped from captured harvester ships. And in a bunker deep under Buenos Aires, a 12-year-old prodigy named Sophia wired her neural interface directly into the defense grid's core, her pupils dilating as she whispered, "Let them come." But the true turning point came when the grid's first test fire lit up the night. A single pulse, amplified through 1,000 stolen amplifiers, sliced through a derelict alien cruiser still drifting near Mars. The blast didn't just vaporize the ship, it warped space around it, a localized gravity quake that bent starlight into strange new shapes. In that moment, as the debris field shimmered like a deadly constellation, humanity realized they weren't just building a shield. They'd forged a blade, and when the first scouts of the new armada crossed the asteroid belt, their sensors screaming about impossible energy signatures emanating from Earth, they made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed the silence from the planet meant surrender. They didn't hear Sophia's heartbeat syncing with the targeting systems, or the general's prayer in Yoruba as she locked onto their lead ship. Most of all, they didn't understand the oldest rule of warfare, the one humanity had tattooed on its bones after a month of hell: you only get to underestimate us once. The new armada arrived not in shadows but in blinding light, 1,000 suns igniting the void as their warships tore through the solar boundary. No demands crackled over the radio this time. No ultimatums whispered in the mind, just a single transmission broadcast on every frequency from deep space to AM static, its message razor edged with condescension. Lay down your arms and your deaths will be swift. The voice belonged to High Executive Rawl, his holographic emissary flickering above the ruins of Geneva with eyes like molten steel. Your defiance amuses us, he sneered, mandibles twitching in what their translators marked as mirth. We are not the harvesters you outwitted, we are the furnace that burns defective tools. What Vroll didn't see, what his scanners couldn't detect beneath Earth's ruined crust, was the laughter. In the bunkers of Montevideo, engineers monitoring his signal exchanged grins as their screens superimposed tactical data over his posturing. Every twitch of his holographic form, every inflection in his voice, matched the behavioral profiles ripped from the harvested fleet's black boxes. The arrogance, the underestimation, even the cadence of his threats was predictable. You have one cycle to comply, Vroll intoned, unaware that human snipers were already painting his projection with targeting lasers for practice. Sophia's fingers danced across her neural interface in Buenos Aires, cross-referencing his ship's energy signature with the database Elena's team had compiled. Their shields oscillate at 800 terahertz, she murmured, teeth flashing as the defense grid adjusted its harmonics in real time, just like the others. Jakob, elbows deep in the guts of a repurposed alien cannon beneath Johannesburg, didn't even look up from his welder. Tell me something new. And in the silence between Vroll's words, as his fleet drifted closer to Earth's orbit, the planet's response was already unfolding. Railguns hidden in dead volcanoes powered up with a subsonic whine. Mines disguised as asteroid debris drifted into position. 1,000 voices whispered the same phrase across secured channels, borrowed from a war humanity had fought centuries ago against itself. Let them come a little closer. The executor's hologram flickered out with a final warning: we will scorch your cities until the very bedrock weeps. never noticing the way General Okoy's scarred hand hovered over the firing console, her other hand clutching a child's crude drawing of the first invasion's downfall. The paper was frayed at the edges, smudged with grease and blood. It showed a stick figure human holding a planet like a grenade. Above them all, the Armada blotted out the stars. Exactly where humanity wanted them. The alien empire's data networks were supposed to be impenetrable fortresses of quantum encryption and bio-locked firewalls, designed by a species that had never lost a cyberwar. Right up until a 17-year-old from Jakarta named Tariq found their backdoor. It wasn't some brilliant hack, not at first, just a glitch in a scavenged alien datapad, a flicker of corrupted code that shouldn't have been accessible to human eyes. But when Tariq fed it through a jury-rigged translator, his breath caught. The error message wasn't in alien glyphs, it was in binary. By dawn, the Resistance knew two things. The invaders' systems weren't just compatible with human programming languages, they were built on them. Stolen, repurposed, and repackaged, sure, but the bones were unmistakable. They didn't invent this, Tariq whispered over the crackling underground radio net, his voice tight with revelation. They plagiarized it. The breach spread like radiation. In Manila, a cell of university students used stolen admin credentials to loop security feeds across an entire labor camp, sending guards chasing ghosts through empty corridors. In what was left of Silicon Valley, a one-eyed coder named Martinez injected a worm into their logistics network, swapping supply manifests until ammunition crates bound for the front lines contained nothing but rocks and spite. And in a bunker beneath Reykjavik, an old woman who'd once designed antivirus software before the invasion began stitching together the ultimate payload, a fractal virus that would eat their systems from the inside out. But the real coup came from an unexpected source, a quiet tech named Yusuf, elbow-deep in the guts of a downed alien drone, his fingers tracing circuitry still warm from its crash. "Look at this," he muttered to the rebel leaning over his shoulder, prying open a panel to reveal a familiar chipset. Same thermal paste we used in gaming rigs back in 2020. Same solder points, same arrogance. He grinned then, a flash of teeth in the dim light, as his screwdriver bridged two contacts that should never have been connected. The drone's remaining power surged backward through its own systems, frying its black box in a shower of sparks. There, overconfident, Yusuf breathed, watching the smoke curl upward. Just like the last ones, word spread faster than the sabotage itself. Within hours, every resistance cell with a scrap of tech expertise was exploiting the same fatal flaw. The aliens hadn't just underestimated human resilience. They'd underestimated our memory. Every piece of their infrastructure had a human ancestor, a blueprint buried in our pre-invasion archives. And as their orbital defenses twitched and glitched under the weight of 1,000 pinpoint strikes, a final message scrawled across every hijacked screen in their fleet, lifted verbatim from Earth's ancient digital war manuals: "Patch your damn systems next time." High above, the Armada's command ship went dark mid-transmission, its shield stuttering as Yusuf's malware unspooled through its veins. By the time they severed the connection, half their drones were broadcasting nursery rhymes on loop, and the other half were busy painting giant phallic symbols across their own hulls with laser targeting systems. Somewhere in the void between stars, an empire that had never known defeat felt the first icy whisper of doubt, because humanity hadn't just hacked their machines. We'd hacked their myth of invincibility, and as Tariq watched the chaos unfold from his makeshift server farm, a gutted McDonald's turned digital war room, he realized the sweetest irony of all: the aliens had come to harvest a planet. Instead, they'd given it the ultimate upgrade, a common enemy, a shared purpose, and now, thanks to their own stolen tech, a weapon they couldn't possibly defend against. Their own arrogance coded in ones and zeros. The EMP strikes didn't come from orbit or hidden bases. They erupted from the heart of the enemy's own strongholds. Sleeper cells who'd spent months posing as broken prisoners, their true purpose hidden behind hollow eyes and trembling hands, moved in perfect sync. In the bowels of the alien command center beneath Budapest, a janitor named Istvan dropped his mop and activated the device sewn into his prosthetic leg. In a soul labor camp, a woman everyone called Grandma pulled the fuse from her walking cane and jammed it into a power junction box. And in the ruins of Cairo, a child's toy car, left conspicuously near an armory for weeks, flared to life, its tiny electromagnetic pulse just strong enough to cascade through the unshielded weapons cache. The effects were instant. Alien drones fell from the sky like stones, battle suits locked up mid-stride, their wearers screaming as neural feedback scorched their synapses. Communications arrays spat static, their encrypted channels overwhelmed by the shrieking harmonics of a million corrupted signals. And in the central command hub of the occupying force, High Executive Roll watched his tactical displays dissolve into garbage code, his claws punching through the holographic projector in rage. Who taught them this? He bellowed, unaware that the answer was scrolling across every dead screen in the facility, a single line of text pulled from humanity's oldest playbook: adapt. Improvise, survive. Chaos spread faster than the EMPs themselves. Ground troops, cut off from command, reverted to protocol, but their protocols had been written assuming human resistance would be disorganized, primitive. Not this, not fighters who'd spent a year studying their patrol patterns, memorizing their weak points, prepping every bridge and tunnel with charges timed to their biometric scanners' refresh rate. A squad of alien shock troopers rounding a corner in Mumbai found themselves staring down a wall of mirrors, their own motion tracking grenades bouncing back at them before they could process the trap. In Buenos Aires, a tank column sank waist-deep into a highway that had been secretly weakened with stolen sonic drills, their shrieking treads only drawing the attention of rooftop snipers armed with jury-rigged armor-piercing rounds. The crowning irony, many of the EMP devices used components stripped from the aliens' own abandoned tech repurposed by human hands they deemed too primitive to understand the machinery. A fact not lost on Commander Crix of the Eastern Occupation Zone when her personal shield generator suddenly overloaded, frying the neural implants that linked her to the fleet. As she crumpled to her knees in the mud outside Kiev, her last sight was a ragged teenager in a stolen engineer's uniform calmly slotting a new power cell into the emitter that had just disabled her. "Thanks for the toys," the kid said, flashing teeth sharpened into points. Then darkness. By the time the orbital fleet realized what was happening, entire divisions had gone dark. Not just defeated, erased, no distress calls, no final stand transmissions, just static where there should have been status reports, and a new message pulsing across every surviving comm channel in their own military cipher. Lesson 2, never leave your teachers unarmed. Somewhere in the wreckage of a Berlin command post, a human prisoner chuckled as her restraints powered down. The aliens had come to break a species. Instead, they'd created something far worse, an army of students who'd been paying very close attention. Elena's fingers danced across the console, her knuckles white with tension as the prototype hummed to life, a monstrous hybrid of alien circuitry and human spite. The air crackled with static, lifting strands of her unwashed hair like a living thing. Behind her, Jakob braced against the wall, his face lit by the erratic glow of overload warnings. "It'll hold for 30 seconds, he rasped, teeth clenched against the feedback whine tearing through the room. Maybe the device wasn't designed for elegance. Its core pulsed with stolen energy, its conduits jury-rigged with scavenged copper and desperation. But as Elena slammed the final sequence home, the jagged harmonics surging through Earth's magnetosphere weren't just disruption, they were direction. A targeted scream shaped by months of dissecting alien comms, of tracing every vulnerable frequency in their systems. The pulse ripped outward, invisible and vicious, a scythe through the Empire's vaunted shields. Above Geneva, the first dreadnought shuddered like a gutted animal. Its pearlescent energy fields flickered, then died mid-recharge, leaving the hull naked against the atmosphere. Secondary explosions bloomed along its underbelly as the ship listed violently, its anti-grav drive spitting blue flame before failing entirely. The ground trembled as it struck the Alps, its death throes echoing across the valley. Elena didn't cheer, didn't even smile. She just watched the tactical feed with hollow eyes as ship after ship winked out of formation, some plummeting, others veering wildly into each other, their network defenses now a death sentence. The invaders had woven their fleet's shields into a single, unbreakable lattice, a masterpiece of cooperation, a fatal flaw. "Payback's a bitch," she murmured, her voice lost in the cacophony of collapsing metal and screaming pilots. The words weren't triumphant, just factual. Behind her, the prototype's casing split with a sound like a bone-snapping, molten coolant spilling across the floor. Jakob yanked her back as the room filled with acrid smoke, but not before she caught the last transmission from the enemy flagship, a voice that had once commanded surrender, now unraveling into static. "What have you done?" the feed cut. The sky burned, and in the sudden silence of the lab, under the broken emergency lights and the distant roar of falling stars, Elena finally let herself slump against the wall. Not in relief, not yet, but with the cold satisfaction of a woman who just proved the oldest human truth. "Give us enough time, and we'll turn your greatest strength into the reason you lose." Human pilots didn't just fly now, they danced. Veterans of the scrap fleet's earliest battles had spent months dissecting every grainy feed, every intercepted comm burst, every recovered black box from downed alien fighters. And one truth had crystallized: the Empire's pilots were rigid, predictable, bound by protocols that treated space like a chessboard, but space wasn't chess. It was a knife fight in zero gravity, and humanity had spent a lifetime sharpening the blade. Captain Mera Soto banked hard through the debris field of a shattered cruiser, her stolen fighter's engines screaming as she inverted mere meters from a gutted transport pod. Behind her, an alien pursuit squadron overshot the maneuver, their formation breaking apart like startled birds. "They fight like amateurs," she laughed over the squadron channel, her voice crackling through static. "We spent a century playing flight sims and dodging asteroids. This is our playground." The dogfights unfolding across the stratosphere weren't just battles, they were brutal lessons in asymmetry. Alien fighters relied on linked targeting systems, their movements synchronized by flawless AI. But human pilots, they flew like their lives depended on improvisation, because they did. A rookie named Perez, barely old enough to shave, corkscrewed his battered interceptor through a hail of plasma fire, luring two enemy ships into a collision with the wrecked hull of an old space station. "Like shooting womp rats back home," he crowed, quoting a film no one under occupation had seen in years. Meanwhile, near the crippled remains of the lunar shipyards, Commander Vance, once a ground pounder with a rusting combat knife, now floated in the gunner's seat of a repurposed alien bomber, his augmented eyes tracking the thermal bloom of an enemy carrier's engines. "You ever seen a wasp sting a bear to death?" he muttered to his co-pilot, a former taxi driver from Jakarta who'd never flown anything before the invasion. The man just grinned as their jury-rigged torpedoes found the carrier's unshielded fuel lines, the explosion painting his goggles orange. Back on Earth, radio operators huddled over scrambled feeds, translating the chaos into something like hope. They didn't just hear victory in the pilot's banter, they heard something far more dangerous: contempt. The aliens had assumed space was their domain. But as squadron after squadron fell to maneuvers no training simulation could predict, as human fighters used planetary gravity wells like slingshots and asteroid shadows like cloaking devices, a terrible realization dawned on the invaders. Their tech was superior, their numbers overwhelming, but their pilots, they'd never fought a species that turned physics into a weapon. And as the last surviving alien commander ordered a full retreat, his transmission laced with something suspiciously close to panic. One final message followed him into the void, broadcast from a stolen fighter with its transponder deliberately left on. "Tell your fleet trainers," Mira's voice echoed across the abandoned battlefield, "to start practicing in gravity wells. We'll be waiting." The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of gunfire. It was the sound of an empire's doctrine shattering against the one force it couldn't outrun. Human audacity, refined in the furnace of occupation into something lethally precise. And as the scrap fleet survivors regrouped, their hulls scorched but intact, the lesson was etched into the stars. You can conquer the ground, but the sky. That's where we play. The flagship didn't just explode, it unraveled, its sleek alien architecture peeling apart in slow motion as the chain reaction tore through its core. Chunks of burning hull the size of city blocks tumbled through the atmosphere, casting eerie shadows across the liberated streets below. On the observation deck of a scavenged orbital platform, Corporal Leon Nguyen leaned into the reinforced glass, her breath fogging the pain as the fireball swelled against the black. "That's for enslaving us," she whispered, her voice hoarse from a month of screaming orders into battle comms. Then louder, throwing the words at the scattering enemy fleet like a grenade. "And that's just the first installment." Below, the sight was electric. Civilians who'd spent weeks cowering in basements now stood in open squares, their faces tilted upward as the sky rained molten debris. In Sao Paulo, a group of children laughed and pointed at the flaming wreckage streaking overhead, their parents too stunned to scold them. In Shanghai, an old man scooped a handful of ash from his balcony, alien alloy turned to powder by atmospheric entry, and let it trickle through his fingers with a smile sharper than any blade. But the real spectacle wasn't the destruction. It was the way the remaining enemy ships broke formation, their flawless coordination shattered into panicked retreat vectors. Some collided in their haste, their shimmering hulls grinding together in showers of sparks. Others jettisoned entire weapon pods to gain speed, leaving their flanks exposed. The vaunted Imperial Armada, which had arrived hours earlier as an unstoppable force, now resembled frightened animals fleeing a brushfire. On the ground, Sergeant Elias Vance watched the chaos through binoculars, his grizzled face unreadable as a dying cruiser plowed into the Mediterranean. "They came thinking we'd break," he said to the young medic beside him, handing over the lenses so she could see for herself. "Now they're learning what happens when they're the ones who can't hold formation." His radio crackled with reports from across the globe, scattered enemy units surrendering, resistance cells emerging from tunnels with stolen plasma rifles, engineers already swarming the wreckage of the flagship's forward section where it had crashed in the Siberian tundra. The medic's laughter was cut short as a new signal burned through every active frequency, not a distress call, not a surrender, but a single looping image. Security footage from inside the flagship's bridge in its final moments, smuggled out via a backdoor hack. The high executor's face frozen mid-snarl as the first explosion rocked the deck. The tactical screens behind him displaying casualty reports in real time. And most damning of all, the way his claws clutched at the armrests of his command throne not in anger but in terror. The footage glitched, then reset, a perfect, humiliating loop broadcast for the galaxy to see. Somewhere in the ruins of New Delhi, a former astrophysicist turned bomb maker adjusted the antenna on her makeshift transmitter, her fingers still blackened from wiring the pulse charges that had crippled the flagship's engines. She didn't cheer, didn't even smile, just watched the sky with narrowed eyes as the last alien vessels vanished beyond the moon's orbit, her mind already calculating trajectories, weak points, contingencies. Because the lesson wasn't over yet, and humanity, we're thorough teachers. The transmission arrived on the Empire's homeworld not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap ripping through secure channels, blaring from public screens, even crackling across the private comms of the High Synod's inner circle. No encryption could contain it, no firewalls could stop it, because Earth hadn't just sent a message. They'd woven it into the fabric of every system they'd stolen, every frequency they'd hacked, every piece of the invaders' own tech now turned against them. The words burned in the air of the council chamber, stark as a plasma scar. Your harvesters broke against us, your armada fled. Cross our orbit again, and we won't stop at driving you back. We'll burn your worlds as you burned ours. Silence followed. Not the quiet of contemplation, but the hollow stillness of predators realizing the prey had fangs. Then the chamber erupted. High Prelate Jorak slammed his foreclaws into the obsidian table, shattering the polished surface as his voice boomed with millennia of entitled rage. We will glass their planet from orbit, scatter their atoms across the void. Across the chamber, Subcommander Vex's her carapace still streaked with plasma burns from the retreated Earth, let out a derisive hiss. With what fleet, the humans didn't just destroy our ships, they studied them, reverse-engineered every weakness, and now, her voice faltered as she gestured to the hologram still flickering above them, showing the wreckage of the flagship crumpling like parchment in atmosphere. The younger voices, the ones who'd grown up on tales of imperial invincibility, roared for vengeance, but in the shadows, the elders, those who remembered the Empire's last catastrophic war, exchanged glances heavy with dread. One, a historian so ancient her exoskeleton had dulled to gray, rasped a single question into the din. What if they're not bluffing? The debate that followed wasn't recorded in official logs. Arguments about human resilience were drowned out by screeches of outrage. Tactical assessments devolved into accusations of cowardice, and through it all, the ultimatum played on a loop in the background, its final clause twisting like a knife. You thought we were weak because we bled. But blood is a lesson, and we've learned yours by heart. By dawn, the Synod's verdict should have been unanimous, should have been righteous. Instead, as the first sun rose over the spires of the imperial capital, the only thing louder than the dissent was the quiet, insidious sound of something the Empire had never known before: doubt. Not about whether they could crush Earth, but whether, win or lose, they'd survive what came after, because humanity hadn't just declared they'd fight back. They'd promised to teach, and the galaxy's most brutal empire was starting to understand. Some lessons leave scars that never fade. The wreckage of the flagship still glowed faintly when Elena picked her way through the twisted metal, her boots crunching on shattered crystalline displays that had once commanded an empire's might. Around her, teams of scavengers and engineers moved like ghosts through the carcass of the ship, their flashlights cutting through the smoke as they pried open access panels and stripped wiring from the walls. But Elena wasn't here for salvage. She crouched beside the remains of the primary navigation console, her fingers tracing the jagged edges of a data core that had miraculously survived the crash. The flickering light from her wrist scanner illuminated glyphs she'd spent months learning to decipher. Then she saw it buried beneath layers of corrupted files, a star map so vast it made her breath catch. Not just tactical positions or supply routes, colonies, dozens of them, pulsing like fireflies across the holographic display now projecting from the cracked core. Outposts on frozen moons, orbital platforms circling gas giants. Even what looked like a sprawling homeworld, its icon ringed by defensive arrays. Jakob appeared at her shoulder, his face streaked with coolant burns. Please tell me that's not just their grocery list. Elena's smile was a blade in the dim light. Better. She zoomed in on a cluster of planets near the edge of the projection, their orbits marked with the same sigil that had adorned the harvesters' hulls. They're breadbasket agricultural hubs. They're not just military targets, they're vulnerable. Back in the makeshift war room, a repurposed subway tunnel lit by stolen alien glow strips, the resistance leaders crowded around the map as Elena laid it bare. Vance leaned in, his knuckles whitening around the edge of the table. You're saying we can starve them out, not just starve. Elena tapped a sequence into the console, and new lines spiderwebbed across the display, supply routes, logistics chains, all threading back to that central homeworld. Every bite of food, every ounce of fuel, every bullet they've used to keep their empire fat flows through these choke points. Her finger hovered over a mining outpost orbiting a crimson dwarf star. And here, that's where they refine the ore for their warships. No shields, minimal garrison. The room buzzed with an energy that hadn't been there since the first days of the invasion. Not just hope, hunger. Tarek, still reeking of smoke from hacking the flagship's dying systems, let out a low whistle. So we don't just hit their army. We burn their farms, cripple their factories, and teach them what happens when you poke a species that invented total war, finished a voice from the shadows. Mira Soto, her flight suit patched with scraps of alien fabric, stepped into the light. Question is, do we have the ships to reach them? Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she swiped the map to a new sector, a jagged asteroid belt on the fringe of explored space. A single icon pulsed there, unmarked by any Imperial sigil. According to their logs, this is where they tested their first planet killers. Abandoned now, but the infrastructure's intact. Her smile returned, colder this time. And it's exactly halfway between us and them. Jakob exhaled sharply, catching her meaning before the others. A forward base. Silence settled over the room, thick as the still warm ashes of the fallen flagship. Then Vance chuckled, the sound like gravel in a tin can. Well then, he said, cracking his scarred knuckles, guess we're going intergalactic. Above them, through layers of rubble and twisted rebar, the stars glittered, no longer just lights in the sky, but targets on a map. And for the first time since the invaders had darkened Earth's skies, humanity wasn't just fighting to survive. We were fighting to win. The launch site wasn't some gleaming spaceport. It was a cratered stretch of the Go-By Desert, where scavenged alien landing pads had been welded to old oil rig scaffolding. The warship itself rose from the dust like a jagged monument, its hull a patchwork of stolen alien alloy and reforged human steel. No banners flew, no speeches blared. Just the electric hum of charging engines and the quiet murmurs of the crew as they boarded, their footsteps echoing through corridors still smelling of fresh solder and desperation. At the helm, Captain Ria Shohari, once a freighter pilot, then a resistance bomber, now something entirely new, ran her fingers over the command console. The screen flickered to life with a stolen tactical feed, the Empire's outermost colony spinning lazily in the void. No defenses, no fear, just the arrogant stillness of a predator who'd never imagined becoming prey. Behind her, the crew strapped in. A former astrophysicist manned navigation, his prosthetic arm clicking as it interfaced with the alien systems. At weapons, a teenager from Lagos who'd spent the occupation reprogramming enemy drones now calibrated plasma cannons with a hacker's precision. And in the engine room, Elena's pulse generator sat bolted to the reactor core, its harmonics tuned to shred Imperial shields like paper. Ria didn't give a rousing speech. She didn't need to. When the countdown hit 0 and the engines roared to life, shaking the desert floor like an earthquake, she simply opened a channel to every surviving resistance frequency on Earth. Her voice cut through the static, calm as a scalpel's edge. Last month they thought they owned us. Last week they learned different. The ship tore free of gravity, its shadow stretching across the dunes below. Today, we remind them how far a cornered animal can leap. The jump drive activated with a sound like thunder cracking the sky in half. For a heartbeat, the ship hung suspended in a halo of blue fire, then vanished, leaving only scorched earth and a message scrawled in the sand where the launch pad had been. 2 words, half erased by the wind but still legible to the drones buzzing overhead. Knock, knock. Light years away, the Empire's border sensors flared with the intrusion, their alarms too slow to matter. By the time the garrison commander scrambled his defenses, the human ship was already dropping out of warp, not hiding, not skulking, but broadcasting its arrival on every Imperial channel. Ria's face filled their screens, her grin all teeth. "You came to Earth uninvited," she said as the weapons array powered up behind her. "We return the favor." The first volley didn't just hit the colony's shield grid. It unmade it, the harmonics turning their own technology against them in a cascade of failing systems. By the time the Imperial fleet even registered the attack, the human ship was gone, not retreating, just repositioning. The colony's comms tower toppled in slow motion, its collapse live streamed to every corner of the Empire. No demands, no negotiations, just the echo of Rhea's last transmission as she plotted the next jump. "Run if you want, we'll find you." Back on Earth, in the ruins of 100 cities, people tilted their heads to the sky, not in prayer but in promise. The war hadn't ended, it had simply changed venues, and humanity, we've always been quick learners, especially when it comes to hunting. The colony hung in the void like a ripe fruit, its domes gleaming under the light of a dying star, beautiful, undefended, and utterly unaware of the storm about to break. Captain Rhea Shohari's ship dropped out of warp with a crackle of displaced energy, its hull still steaming from the jump. No stealth, no subterfuge. Just the raw, deliberate weight of a predator announcing its presence. "Colony Aureline 9. Rhea's voice blared across every Imperial frequency, the ship's stolen transponder overriding local comms. "You have 10 minutes to signal surrender. After that, we assume you'd rather fight." Silence, then chaos. The colony's docking bays erupted with scrambling fighters, their engines flaring as they formed a defensive screen. But something was wrong. The ships weren't locking weapons, they weren't even powering shields. Instead, their formation wavered not from fear but from hesitation. Inside the colony's central dome, a different kind of rebellion was already unfolding. Workers in tattered Imperial uniforms wrenched open maintenance hatches, their tools repurposed into weapons. A child, no older than 7, darted through the streets, her arms laden with stolen data drives. And in the governor's tower, a figure in tattered robes slammed a bloodied fist onto the comm console, his voice raw with fury. "Do you think we haven't been waiting for this?" The feed from the surface flickered across Rhea's screen, not a distress call, but a live stream of the governor's limp body being dragged through the streets by his own staff. The colony's second-in-command, a gaunt woman with chemical burns tracing her arms, stared into the camera. "We've been sabotaging their supply lines for months," she hissed. "Cut the comm tower and every outpost in this sector goes dark with it." Rhea didn't hesitate. "Give me coordinates," she ordered as her weapons officer input the targeting data. The orbital cannon didn't just destroy the tower, it vaporized the Imperial insignia carved into its base, the blast rippling outward in a wave of shattered glass and liberated screams. By dawn, Aureline 9 docks were swarming with ships, but not the Empire's, freighters, mining vessels, even a salvaged pleasure yacht, its hull hastily painted with the jagged sigil of Earth resistance. They came not as conquerors, but as kin. "Welcome to the war," Rhea told the rebel leader as they shook hands in the shadow of the burning tower. The woman's grip was calloused, her smile sharper than any blade. "You're late," she replied, jerking her chin toward the armada of stolen ships now powering up behind her. "We've got 12 more colonies ready to flip." "Question, is you staying to watch the fireworks?" The answer came not in words, but in the thunder of engines as Rhea's ship pivoted toward the next Imperial outpost, its cannons humming with fresh ammunition. Some lessons couldn't be taught, they had to be lived, and humanity, we'd just given the galaxy its first taste of revolution. The Imperial throne room was never meant to echo. Built to swallow dissent in its vast, obsidian expanse, its acoustics now amplified every ragged breath the ruler took as holographic feeds flickered around him, showing human warships materializing like specters around his homeworld's defensive perimeter. His mandibles twitched as he input the final encryption sequence himself, his claws trembling against the console. The transmission that slithered across the void wasn't a command. It was a plea, cease hostilities. The ruler's voice crackled across the bridge of Elena's flagship, stripped of its former thunder. We offer conditional surrender. Withdraw your fleets and we will. Elena's laugh cut through the static like a scalpel. Conditional. The word dripped with venom as she leaned toward the screen, her reflection superimposed over the ruler's bloated silhouette. Behind her, tactical displays pulsed with targeting data. Every imperial stronghold, every shipyard, every last vein of their empire laid bare. You burned our cities. Enslaved our children. You don't get to negotiate after what you did. Silence stretched between stars. Then the feeds from the surface began flooding in, not of panicked citizens but of uprising. Mining colonies detonating their own shafts to trap garrison troops. Dockworkers jettisoning entire bays of imperial fighters into the void. A throng of former slaves storming the Royal Guard's armory, their hands still bearing the scars of shackles now wrapped around stolen plasma rifles. The ruler's compound, once untouchable, was already ringed with fire. Jakob's voice was barely audible over the cheering that erupted through the ship's comms. Their own people are turning. Elena didn't smile. She tapped a command into her console, and every human ship, every stolen imperial cruiser, every jury-rigged battleship, every defiant scrap of the fleet that had clawed its way from Earth's ruins lit their weapons in unison. A constellation of retribution glowing red against the homeworld's night side. Here are our terms, she said softly as the first orbital bombardments began raining down on the outer defense grids. You die, they live. The transmission cut with a screech of feedback, leaving only the steady beep of torpedoes locking onto the throne room's coordinates. Somewhere below, the ruler was screaming, but Elena had already turned away. Justice, she knew, didn't need an audience, just impeccable timing. The throne room's obsidian walls glowed orange with reflected fire as the Empire's last defenders fell not to human weapons but to the hands of their own people. The streets of the imperial capital, once polished to a mirror sheen, ran thick with the ink-like blood of nobles dragged from their palaces. In the grand hall where 1,000 worlds had been sentenced to servitude, a rebel leader from Auraline 9 stood atop the overturned throne, her boots crushing the ruler's severed carapace into the shattered mosaic below. She raised a bottle of looted victory wine, its label half scorched away, and the room fell silent. To the slaves who became conquerors, she rasped, her voice raw from months of whispered rebellion. The toast echoed through the cavernous space, bouncing off the broken bodies of shock troops and the trembling forms of former bureaucrats now pressed face down on the floor. To the gardeners who poisoned their masters' feasts, the miners who rigged their own tunnels to collapse, the children who taught us how to hide knives in song. She took a long swallow, then hurled the bottle against the wall where it exploded like a tiny supernova. May the galaxy never forget what happens when you mistake chains for weakness. Outside, the sky pulsed with the lights of arriving ships, not just Earth's patchwork fleet, but vessels from a dozen liberated worlds, their hulls still bearing the scars of occupation. A Venlian grain hauler, its holds once stuffed with stolen crops, now brimming with freed prisoners. A Crixian battlecruiser, its crew having turned their plasma cannons on their officers mid-transit. Even a stolen Imperial pleasure barge, its glittering spars repurposed into field hospitals, floated serenely above the carnage. Elena watched the scene unfold from the flagship's viewport, her reflection superimposed over the burning skyline. She'd expected triumph to taste sweeter. Instead, it settled in her chest like shrapnel, jagged and unyielding. They'll call this justice, she murmured to Jakob, who stood beside her with a datapad listing the Empire's remaining strongholds. But it's just arithmetic. They hurt us, we hurt them worse. He didn't argue, just swiped to the next screen, showing the real-time collapse of Imperial supply lines across 3 spiral arms. Speaking of arithmetic, the scrap fleet's already looting their shipyards. Vance is organizing a council on Titan to draft the new accords and Ren's people. A grim smile. They've hacked every Imperial archive. By dawn, every enslaved world will know how we did it. Somewhere below, the rebels had started singing, a throaty, discordant anthem stitched together from 100 languages, its only common thread the rhythm of stomping boots on broken marble. The sound shuddered through the ship's hull, vibrating in Elena's teeth. She closed her eyes, not in prayer, not in exhaustion, just to memorize the weight of this moment, the exact pressure point where vengeance tipped into something stranger. Something new. When she opened them again, the first unshackled sunrise was breaking over the capital's ruins, its light catching the edges of drifting debris like floating embers. The Empire had fallen in a night. The galaxy would take longer to burn, and humanity, we'd already started passing out the torches. The streets of Earth were no longer graveyards of rubble, they were rivers of light. Where alien warships had once cast their shadows, fireworks now painted the sky in colors too vibrant to name. Children who'd spent their lives cowering in bunkers danced barefoot on the cracked concrete of old missile silos, their laughter mixing with the distant hum of ships returning from the front. The air smelled of burning metal and something sweeter, hope, stubborn as weeds breaking through pavement. In a plaza where statues of conquerors had stood, someone had erected a new monument, not carved from marble or steel, but welded together from the wreckage of 100 alien fighters. It loomed jagged and defiant, its surface studded with the melted remains of Imperial insignias. At its base, a boy no older than 5 pressed his palm against a piece of salvaged hull still warm from re-entry. His voice, when it came, was soft with wonder. "Mama, what happens now?" The soldier beside him, her uniform patched with scraps of enemy banners, her face a map of old burns, didn't answer right away. She watched the crowd surging around them, engineers arguing over blueprints for deep space colonies, former prisoners tattooing coordinates of liberated worlds onto each other's skin, a group of teenagers stacking stolen plasma rifles like kindling for a bonfire. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with the growl of wartime commands, but with the quiet certainty of someone who'd seen the future in the embers of the past. Now she ruffled the boy's hair, her fingers pausing on the scar where an Imperial scanner had gouged his temple during a routine inspection. "Now we do whatever the hell we please." High above, the first of Earth's new fleet glinted in orbit. Not warships, not scouts, but something far more dangerous. Arcs built from the bones of dead invaders, their holds crammed with seeds and schematics and dreams too big for any single planet to contain. The soldiers' gaze tracked their silhouettes as they passed across the sun, casting brief, flickering shadows. 1 month to break an empire, a lifetime to build what came next. And in the silence between the fireworks and the singing, beneath the weight of all that hard-won sky, the boy reached up and slipped his hand into hers. Not for reassurance, not in fear, but because the stars weren't just lights anymore, they were destinations, and humanity, we'd always been restless travelers. Somewhere beyond the atmosphere, an alien distress beacon still pulsed, its signal fading into the void like a warning. No one bothered to silence it. Let the galaxy hear, let them remember the war had ended, the lesson was just beginning.